Number 1. Khalil Wheeler-Weaver, the tagged killer, brought down by his victim's own friends. In the fall of 2016, a young man from Orange, New Jersey, named Khalil Wheeler-Weaver, appeared to most people who encountered him as an unremarkable and pleasant presence. He was 20 years old, neatly dressed, and worked 2 jobs simultaneously, one as a security guard at a local hotel and another at a grocery store. He had grown up in the well-to-do Seven Oaks neighborhood of Orange, a community that sat in comfortable contrast to the rougher parts of Essex County that surrounded it. His family had deep roots in law enforcement. His stepfather was an active detective in the neighboring town of East Orange, and his uncle was a retired officer from the Newark Police Department. Wheeler-Weaver had attended Orange High School with the graduating class of 2014, where classmates described him as quiet and somewhat introverted, a young man who wore tucked-in shirts and khaki pants and showed no particular interest in sports, extracurricular activities, or socializing. He kept to himself, dated no one, and left almost no impression on the people around him. Detectives who later interviewed him described him as calm and cooperative, even helpful in his manner. There was nothing about Khalil Wheeler-Weaver's outward presentation that suggested to anyone who knew him that behind that carefully maintained surface, he was concealing something profoundly dangerous. But when investigators later obtained his phone and examined his search history, they found queries that told a very different story, including searches for how to create homemade substances capable of causing fatal harm to another person. Wheeler-Weaver had apparently been contemplating the mechanics of taking a human life long before he ever acted on it. The platform Wheeler-Weaver chose to identify his victims was Tagged, a social discovery and dating application that allowed users to connect with strangers in their geographic area. He created multiple profiles on the platform under pseudonyms including Lil Yacht Rock and Pimp Killer Ghost, personas that bore no resemblance to the quiet, well-dressed young man his neighbors and coworkers thought they knew. Operating under these aliases, he reached out to women and offered them money in exchange for meeting him privately. According to investigators and later trial testimony, Wheeler-Weaver specifically targeted women he believed were economically vulnerable and socially marginalized, women he calculated would not be immediately reported missing, and whose disappearances he assumed would not be aggressively investigated. This calculated targeting of women he deemed expendable would become a central theme in the prosecution's case against him, and the prosecutor's closing arguments would directly confront that assumption by affirming loudly and clearly that every one of his victims mattered deeply to the people who loved them. The first woman Wheeler-Weaver targeted was 19-year-old Robin Daphne Michelle West, a young woman from Philadelphia who had been living in Union Township, New Jersey. On the night of August 31, 2016, witnesses saw Robin getting into a car with Wheeler-Weaver. She was killed within hours of that last sighting. Wheeler-Weaver placed her body inside an abandoned house not far from his own home in Orange, and then set the structure on fire in an attempt to conceal the evidence of what he had done. The fire complicated the identification of Robin's remains significantly, and it took approximately 2 weeks before her family received confirmation of what had happened to her. Robin's mother, Anita Mason, would later describe her daughter at Wheeler-Weaver's sentencing as a young woman with a distinctive walk, a radiant smile, and a generous heart, a person who had expressed a deep desire to help people experiencing homelessness. She was 19 years old. She had her entire life ahead of her. Roughly 6 weeks after Robin West's death, on October 22, 2016, Wheeler-Weaver made contact with 33-year-old Joanne Brown of Newark through the same tagged platform. Joanne Brown was also killed, and her body was left inside another vacant home in Orange, where it was discovered on December 5, 2016. Between the deaths of Robin West and Joanne Brown, Wheeler-Weaver had also attempted to harm another woman named Tiffany Taylor, who became arguably the most important witness the prosecution would ever put before a jury. Wheeler-Weaver had connected with Taylor through the Tagged app, taken her to a motel in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then restrained her with handcuffs and duct tape before carrying out a brutal sexual assault and leaving her in a condition that prosecutors charged as attempted murder. Taylor, displaying extraordinary composure and presence of mind in an almost unimaginable situation, managed to persuade Wheeler-Weaver to drive her back to the motel where she had left her phone, told him she needed to retrieve it, and once inside, locked him out of the room and immediately called 911. When police arrived, Wheeler-Weaver had already left. Officers initially treated Taylor with skepticism rather than compassion, and she described later being threatened with arrest rather than offered assistance. Despite this treatment, Tiffany Taylor would go on to become one of the most powerful witnesses at Wheeler-Weaver's trial, and the details she provided about her attack, matching precisely the pattern of what had been done to Robin West and Joanne Brown, helped investigators build the framework of a serial case. The final confirmed victim in Wheeler-Weaver's known pattern of offenses was 20-year-old Sarah Butler, a freshman at Jersey City University who lived in Montclair and had a warmth and vibrancy that everyone who knew her described in virtually identical terms. Sarah loved to dance, worked as a lifeguard at her local Yimka, and was deeply loved by her family and a wide circle of friends. Wheeler-Weaver contacted her through Tagged in the days before her death and offered her $500 to meet with him privately. Sarah was clearly uneasy. In one message exchange that was later read aloud during trial proceedings, she asked him directly, "You're not a serial killer, right?" Tragically, he was. Sarah Butler was last seen alive on November 22, 2016, just days before Thanksgiving. Her body was discovered on December 1, 2016, at Eagle Rock Reservation in West Orange, concealed beneath a pile of sticks and leaves. She was 20 years old. What happened next transformed this case from a series of unsolved disappearances into one of the most remarkable citizen-led investigative efforts in modern true crime history. Sarah Butler's family and friends were not willing to simply grieve and wait. Her sister knew the passwords to Sarah's social media accounts, including her tagged profile. She logged into Sarah's account, went through her communications from the days leading up to her disappearance, and found the conversation between Sarah and the man who had been messaging her. That man was Khalil Wheeler-Weaver. Sarah's sister and a close friend created a new fake profile on Tagged and used it to make contact with Wheeler-Weaver directly, posing as a potential victim in order to draw him into the open. But crucially, and this is what made the operation both effective and legally sound, they immediately brought what they were doing to the attention of Montclair police investigators, who then took over the management of the sting in coordination with them. Together, the young women and law enforcement investigators arranged a meeting with Wheeler-Weaver at a specific location in Montclair. On December 6, 2016, just 5 days after Sarah's body had been found, Wheeler-Weaver arrived at the arranged location, expecting to meet a woman he had connected with online. Instead, he was met by undercover police officers and taken into custody without incident. On the day of his arrest, officers searched Wheeler-Weaver's home and found 3 mobile phones in his bedroom. The investigation that followed would prove to be as meticulous as it was damning. Detectives worked through the digital evidence on those phones with extraordinary thoroughness. Cell tower data placed Wheeler-Weaver in the precise locations where each of the 3 women had last been seen and where their bodies had subsequently been found. His search history contained queries that left no reasonable room for ambiguity about his intentions and his consciousness of guilt. 40 witnesses were assembled for the prosecution, spanning law enforcement investigators, forensic experts, people who had interacted with Wheeler-Weaver through social media platforms, and individuals who had direct knowledge of specific aspects of each case. A small but decisive amount of DNA recovered from underneath Sarah Butler's fingernails was consistent with Wheeler-Weaver's genetic profile. The prosecution also entered into evidence a recording of a police interview in which Wheeler-Weaver made statements that prosecutors described as deeply incriminating. The case that emerged from this evidence was comprehensive, interlocking, and built on multiple independent lines of proof. digital records, physical evidence, cell data, and the testimony of the woman who had survived and was now ready to tell her story to a jury. The trial concluded in December 2019. The Essex County jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Wheeler-Weaver was convicted of 3 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of Robin West, Joanne Brown, and Sarah Butler. He was also found guilty of kidnapping, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and attempted murder in connection with the attack on Tiffany Taylor. Additional convictions were recorded for 3 counts of desecration of human remains and aggravated arson. Wheeler-Weaver maintained throughout the trial and afterward that he had been framed. He offered no evidence to support that claim, and the jury rejected it entirely. Sentencing took place on October 6, 2021. Before Superior Court Judge Mark S. Alley delivered his ruling, the courtroom heard from the families of the victims in a series of impact statements that were raw, grief-filled, and deeply human. Victor Butler, Sarah's father, addressed Wheeler-Weaver directly from the witness stand. Robin West's mother, Anita Mason, described the irreplaceable qualities of a daughter whose presence could not be replicated. Tiffany Taylor spoke about how her entire existence had been altered by what Wheeler-Weaver had done to her, that she no longer wore makeup, no longer had the same friends, no longer moved through the world with the freedom she had once taken for granted. She addressed the judge plainly. She hoped he would show no mercy, because none had been shown to her. Judge Alley sentenced Khalil Wheeler-Weaver to 160 years in New Jersey State Prison. Under the No Early Release Act, he must serve a minimum of 145 years before he becomes eligible for parole, a threshold that, given his age at the time of sentencing, he will never realistically reach. He will spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. Wheeler-Weaver subsequently appealed his conviction, arguing that the separate murder cases should have been tried individually, that the jury had received flawed instructions, and that the sentence was excessive. In 2022, a 3-judge appellate panel rejected every one of those arguments in a 34-page ruling, writing that the sentence was fully justified by the nature of his offenses. That same year, prosecutors filed an additional charge connecting Wheeler-Weaver to the 2016 death of 15-year-old Mawa Doumbia of Newark, whose remains had been discovered in a carriage house in Orange in April 2019 and remained unidentified for more than 2 years. That case remains pending. The prosecutor who led the original case captured the meaning of the outcome with clarity at the time of sentencing. Wheeler-Weaver had believed the women he targeted were disposable, that no one would care what happened to them. He was wrong. The friends and family of Sarah Butler refused to accept that assumption. They went looking for answers themselves, built a trap using the same digital tools he had used against his victims, and handed a serial predator to law enforcement within days of the last body being found. At his trial, Assistant Essex County Prosecutor Adam Wells made it plain. Sarah's friends and family are the heroes of this case. The jury agreed, the appeals court agreed, and Khalil Wheeler-Weaver, the young man from a law enforcement family who grew up in a comfortable neighborhood and presented a calm, cooperative face to the world, is now spending every remaining year of his life behind bars. Number 2. Keith Hunter Jesperson, the happy face killer, exposed by his own brother and his girlfriend's death. Keith Hunter Jesperson was born on April 6, 1955, in Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada, the middle child of 5 siblings in a household defined largely by the domineering and often abusive presence of his father, Leslie Jesperson. From early childhood, Jesperson was treated as an outsider both at home and among his peers, subjected to ridicule from other children who targeted him for his unusual physical size. He would grow to stand 6 feet and 6 inches tall, and receiving from his father a form of conditional, impossible-to-satisfy attention that left him feeling perpetually inadequate and invisible. His mother, Gladys, was described by those familiar with the family as largely absent in any meaningful emotional sense. The home Jesperson grew up in was not a nurturing one, and the effects of that environment manifested in his behavior at a remarkably early age. By the time he was 5 years old, Jesperson had begun capturing small animals, cats, birds, dogs, and causing them deliberate harm through force and strangulation. This pattern of behavior toward animals, which criminologists and forensic psychologists have long identified as among the most consistent early warning signs of developing violent psychopathology, continued throughout his childhood and was known to the people around him. As a young person, Jesperson also made 2 separate attempts to seriously harm children who had antagonized him, incidents that might, in retrospect, appear as clear indicators of the trajectory his life would follow. Despite all of this, he graduated from high school, secured employment as a long-haul truck driver, married a woman named Rose Huckey in 1975, and over the course of a 15-year marriage, fathered 3 children. His daughter Melissa Moore would later describe him as intimidating and emotionally disturbing even within the family context, though he did not harm his immediate family members physically. On the surface, Keith Jesperson appeared to be an ordinary working man with an ordinary life. The surface, as it so often does in cases like his, concealed something entirely different. Jesperson had harbored an ambition to join the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a goal that spoke to his desire for authority, respect, and institutional recognition, the kind of validation he had never received from his father or his peers. That ambition was extinguished when a physical injury ended his candidacy for the force. The failure hit him profoundly. He continued driving trucks, and when his marriage collapsed after 15 years in 1990, he found himself alone on the road with his resentments, his sense of inadequacy, and the accumulated weight of a lifetime of feeling overlooked. It was in that context, and in that year, that Jesperson began to kill. His victims were predominantly women he encountered during his trucking routes, many of them at truck stops, many of them living in circumstances of social and economic vulnerability. He chose them with the same calculated logic that Wheeler-Weaver would employ years later. He targeted people he assumed would not be aggressively searched for, women whose disappearances he believed would be absorbed into the noise of missing persons statistics, without generating the kind of sustained investigative pressure that would lead back to him. His first confirmed victim was 23-year-old Tanja Bennett, whom Jesperson encountered at a bar near Portland, Oregon, on January 21, 1990. Tanja Bennett was killed that night, and what happened in the immediate aftermath of her death set in motion a chain of events that would paradoxically allow Jesperson to continue for 5 more years. A woman named Laverne Pavlinac, who was trapped in a long-term abusive relationship with a man named John Sosnovsky, read newspaper coverage of Tanja Bennett's death and made a calculated decision to tell police that she and Sosnovsky had been responsible for the killing, hoping that a murder conviction would provide her with a permanent escape from the abuse she was suffering. It was a desperate and ultimately catastrophic miscalculation. Pavlinac later recanted her statement and told investigators she had fabricated it, but a jury nonetheless found her guilty in 1991, and Sosnovsky pleaded guilty to avoid the possibility of a death sentence. Both were imprisoned for a crime they had not committed. Jesperson, watching from the road as 2 innocent people were sent to prison in his place, understood what their convictions meant for him. As long as law enforcement believed the Bennett case was solved, there was no investigation looking in his direction. He was free to continue. The victims whose deaths followed Tanja Bennett's were women whose lives have in some cases taken years to fully document and confirm. Cynthia Lynn Rose, Patricia Skipple, Suzanne Kahlenberg, Lori Ann Pentland, Angela Mae Sobrise, women encountered at truck stops or rest areas across Oregon, Washington, California, Florida, Nebraska, and Wyoming, killed across a 5-year span, during which Jesperson covered thousands of miles of road and left almost no physical evidence that could be connected across state lines. Strangulation was his consistent method, the same technique he had practiced on animals as a child, applied now with the physical strength of a man who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall. because his victims were found in different jurisdictions, because many of them were women living outside stable social networks, and because law enforcement agencies in the early 1990s lacked the digital tools and interjurisdictional communication systems that investigators have today, the connections between the cases were extraordinarily difficult to establish. Jesperson moved through the country like a ghost, his truck routes providing him with both cover and opportunity. What eventually began to unravel his carefully maintained anonymity was not a law enforcement breakthrough. It was his own psychological need to be recognized. Jesperson was profoundly frustrated by the fact that Pavlinac and Sosnovsky were receiving attention and notoriety for a crime he had committed. He wanted acknowledgement. He craved the acknowledgement. And so he began writing letters, anonymous confessions, sent to newspaper offices and left on the walls of public restrooms, each one signed with a hand-drawn smiley face. It was these smiley faces that gave him the nickname by which he is now universally known, the Happy Face Killer. The letters contained specific details about the crimes that only the actual perpetrator could have known, and while they initially generated more confusion than clarity for investigators, they established a thread of evidence that would eventually be traced back to him. Jesperson was essentially conducting a sustained, egotistical negotiation with the public record, insisting on credit for what he had done even while remaining anonymous, and this pattern of behavior, psychologists have noted, is characteristic of a particular category of offender who kills partly for the sense of power and recognition that the act provides, and who finds the absence of that recognition intolerable. The chain of events that ended Jesperson's killing span began on March 10, 1995, when he took the life of Julie Winningham in Washington state. Julie Winningham was not a stranger he had encountered at a truck stop. She was a woman with whom Jesperson had been in a personal relationship, his girlfriend. Her death was different from his previous crimes, in a critical structural sense. There was someone who knew exactly who she had been associated with, who could connect her to a specific named individual, and who would be asked by investigators from the very beginning about the people in her life. When Julie Winningham's body was discovered the following day, March 11, 1995, law enforcement quickly established that she had been in a relationship with Jesperson. He became a suspect almost immediately, not through any complex investigative deduction, but simply because the people who knew Julie knew about him. When detectives brought him in for questioning, the pressure of the situation overwhelmed him. He attempted to take his own life twice while in custody, the first strong indicator that he understood what was coming, and ultimately confessed to Julie Winningham's murder. But it was what happened in parallel that made Jesperson's exposure complete and permanent. Before his arrest, while still a free man, Jesperson had written a letter to his brother Brad Jesperson in which he poured out a confession of extraordinary scope. "I am sorry that I turned out this way," the letter read. "I have been a killer for 5 years and have killed 8 people." Brad Jesperson took that letter to law enforcement. Combined with Jesperson's confession regarding Julie Winningham and the confession letters he had already been sending anonymously to the press, the case assembled itself with devastating speed. Jesperson was arrested on March 30, 1995. Once in custody and resigned to the fact that there was no longer any path to freedom, he began providing investigators with detailed accounts of all 8 of his confirmed murders. He also claimed, in statements made over subsequent years, to have killed as many as 160 women, a figure that investigators have never been able to corroborate. 8 murders have been confirmed, and those 8 are the foundation of the legal case against him. The trial proceedings moved forward with the kind of efficiency that tends to characterize cases built on extensive confessions and physical evidence. Jesperson was convicted of multiple counts of murder, including aggravated murder charges in Oregon, and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in Oregon State Penitentiary. In September 2009, a 4th charge was filed against him in Riverside County, California, in connection with an additional homicide, and he was extradited to face those charges. A fourth life sentence was added to his term. He remains incarcerated at Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, where he continues to give interviews, make claims about additional victims, and write correspondence that has attracted ongoing media and academic interest. One of the most poignant dimensions of the Jesperson case came from within his own family. His daughter, Melissa Moore, who later changed her surname, wrote a memoir titled Shattered Silence, in which she described the particular psychological experience of growing up in proximity to a man who frightened her even without her understanding why, and discovering as an adult that her father was one of America's most prolific serial killers. The wrongful convictions of Laverne Pavlinac and John Sosnovsky were eventually overturned once it was established that Jesperson was the actual perpetrator of Tonya Bennett's death, and both were released from prison. Their years of wrongful imprisonment remain one of the most troubling secondary consequences of Jesperson's crimes, a reminder that the harm done by serial offenders extends far beyond their immediate victims and into the lives of everyone caught in the wake of their actions. Number 3. Robert Pickton, the pig farmer whose own worker sounded the alarm that no one wanted to hear. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, the second of 3 children, born to Leonard and Louise Pickton, who had operated a pig farm on Dominion Avenue for generations. The Pickton family's circumstances were shaped heavily by the demands and aesthetic of farm life in its most unadorned form, and Robert and his brother David were put to work on the property from a very young age, while their sister Linda was sent to Vancouver to be raised in a different environment entirely. Louise Pickton was described by those who knew the family as a tough and demanding presence, a woman who prioritized the farm's operations above most other considerations, including the social development and hygiene of her children. Robert and David attended school wearing clothes that carried the persistent odor of the farm, and they were bullied as a result. Set apart from their peers by the visible markers of a childhood lived in close proximity to livestock and heavy agricultural labor. Robert dropped out of school in 1963 at approximately 14 years of age and began working as a meat cutter, a trade he practiced until he was around 21, at which point he returned to the farm permanently. Leonard Pickton died in 1978. Louise followed him in 1979, and the 3 siblings inherited the property. Over the subsequent years, Robert and David sold portions of the inherited land for a total of approximately $5 million and used the resources to expand and diversify their business interests, including a salvage and dirt-moving operation that brought a rotating cast of workers and contractors onto the property. By the early 1990s, the farm had taken on a character that was difficult to classify. The pig farming operation had diminished significantly. Robert kept only a small number of pigs by that point, occasionally buying animals at auction and bringing them to the property in a horse trailer for slaughter. The land itself had accumulated years of machinery, old vehicles, and industrial equipment that gave it the appearance of a working junkyard rather than a functioning agricultural business. The large barn on the property, an unpainted Dutch-style structure, had been repurposed at various points for parties and social gatherings that drew attendees from Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood approximately 27 kilometers away that had long been associated with poverty, addiction, and the sex trade. Robert Pickton had developed a pattern of driving into the downtown east side regularly, where he frequented areas known for sex work and established contact with women living on the margins of the city's social infrastructure. He was described by people who encountered him as a quiet and socially awkward man, difficult to engage in conversation, who gave off an energy that many people who later reflected on their interactions with him described in retrospect as unsettling. One worker who spent time on the property during the early years of Pickton's crimes described a massive 600-pound boar that roamed the property alongside dogs and which would charge aggressively at people who came near, an image that has become part of the broader cultural memory of what the farm represented. The women who began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s were overwhelmingly women living in conditions of deep social vulnerability. Women engaged in sex work, women struggling with addiction, women who in many cases were indigenous and who had been failed repeatedly by social service systems and law enforcement institutions. Their disappearances were reported by family members, by community advocates, and by organizations working in the downtown East Side. But for years, these reports were not treated by police with the urgency that the mounting number of absences demanded. Advocates and family members of the missing women have since documented in painful detail how their attempts to draw attention to the pattern of disappearances were repeatedly minimized, delayed, or dismissed. This systemic failure, rooted in institutional biases about whose disappearances warranted sustained investigative resources, allowed Robert Pickton to continue his offenses for far longer than any properly functioning system of public safety should have permitted. It was a man named Bill Hiscox who first drew a direct line between the women disappearing from Vancouver's streets and the pig farm in Port Coquitlam. Hiscox worked for the Pickton brothers' salvage business and spent time on and around the property in the late 1990s. What he observed in that time troubled him deeply. Women who came to the farm, he noticed, had a tendency not to leave, or at least not to be seen leaving. Inside Pickton's trailer and around the property, Hiscox noticed items that he recognized as belonging to women who had been reported missing: purses, identification cards, clothing. He also knew that Robert Pickton drove into Vancouver's downtown East Side regularly, seeking out the company of women in the sex trade. Hiscox contacted Crime Stoppers and the Vancouver Police Department and told them what he had seen. All the girls that are going missing, he told investigators, and all the purses and IDs that are out there in his trailer. He also told police explicitly that Pickton frequents the downtown area all the time for girls. His information was specific, it was detailed, and it pointed directly at a named individual and a named location. Police visited the Pickton property on 3 separate occasions following Hiscox's tip and, according to subsequent inquiries, found insufficient evidence to proceed further at those times. A separate tip came in during June 1999 from another source alleging the presence of a freezer containing human remains on the property. That tip was also not aggressively pursued. Bill Hiscox continued to press his concerns. He was not listened to in any meaningful way for years. A prior violent incident had also placed Robert Pickton directly in the sights of law enforcement before any of the confirmed murders were later established. In 1997, a woman named Wendy Lynn Eistetter was found near the Pickton property in a condition consistent with a serious assault. She had Pickton's blood on her clothing. The circumstances of the incident, which Pickton attributed to a mutual altercation, led to Pickton being charged with attempted murder. He was released on a $2,000 bond. The attempted murder charge was dismissed in January 1998. The dismissal left a dangerous man free to return to his property and continue what he had been doing. Bill Hiscox read the news reports about the attempted murder charge and the women going missing from the downtown East Side and placed the picture together in his own mind. His subsequent calls to law enforcement were the closest thing to a functioning early warning system that this case ever produced, and they were not acted upon with the urgency they deserved. The moment that ultimately cracked the case open came not from a sustained investigation into the missing women, but from a report about an illegal firearm. In February 2002, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police received a tip from an informant that an illegal weapon was present on the Pickton property. Officers executed a search warrant on February 5, 2002, with the stated objective of locating the firearm. What they found in the course of that search transformed the operation almost immediately into something of an entirely different order of magnitude. In the debris and equipment on the property, officers found a wallet containing photographs of women who had been reported missing. In a refrigeration unit, they found human remains. The search warrant was expanded. Robert Pickton and his brother David were both taken into custody initially in connection with the firearms matter. Robert was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder on February 25, 2002, in connection with the deaths of Serena Abotsway and Mona Wilson, whose DNA had been matched to material recovered from the property. From that point, the investigation scaled to become the largest forensic operation in Canadian history. The search of the Pickton property, designated Project Greenleaf, lasted over 2 years. Investigators processed approximately 200,000 cubic meters of soil. They recovered more than 600 bone fragments from at least 6 confirmed victims. DNA evidence linked to 33 women was found across the property. Women's clothing was discovered in the pig enclosures. A flash drive found during the search contained photographs taken at parties held on the farm, images that showed some of the missing women in the final period before they disappeared. Evidence also indicated that Pickton had processed some of the remains of his victims through his pig slaughter operation and had mixed material into meat that was then distributed to people who had no knowledge of what it contained. A detail that caused profound additional distress to the families of the victims and to the broader public when it became known. In a conversation with an undercover police officer posing as a fellow inmate, Pickton confessed to 49 murders and told the officer he had been caught because he had become sloppy. He also expressed a desire to have committed one more offense before his arrest, to reach a total of 50. Murder charges were filed incrementally as forensic identification proceeded, ultimately reaching a total of 27 first-degree murder counts. The decision was made by prosecutors to proceed initially to trial on 6 of those charges, with the possibility of trying the remaining counts afterward. The trial began in January 2007. During opening arguments, the prosecution presented the confession Pickton had made to the undercover officer, along with the extensive forensic evidence gathered during the 2-year search. The defense challenged the admissibility of various pieces of evidence, but was ultimately unsuccessful in having the most significant materials excluded. On December 9, 2007, the jury returned its verdict. Pickton was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The charges related to the deaths of Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josberry, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Georgina Papin, and Marnie Frey. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole, for 25 years. The remaining 21 murder charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010, following legal proceedings related to the trial structure, though the evidence supporting those charges was never formally contested at trial. Pickton's sentence was effectively a life term, given his age and the parole restrictions. The case generated a formal public inquiry, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Commissioner Wally Opal, which examined in detail the systemic failures that had allowed so many women to disappear without generating an adequate law enforcement response. The inquiry's findings were damning. They identified failures at multiple institutional levels, including inadequate coordination between police jurisdictions, entrenched biases in how reports of missing women from the downtown East Side were assessed, and a failure to treat the pattern of disappearances as the serial predation it demonstrably was. The families of the victims and Indigenous advocacy organizations have continued to press for broader accountability for these failures, arguing that the Commission's findings did not go far enough in assigning institutional responsibility. Bill Hiscox, the worker who sounded the alarm years before anyone acted on it, received a portion of a $100,000 reward for the information he provided. The recognition of his role, while financially meaningful, came against the backdrop of a devastating question that the inquiry could not fully answer. What might have been prevented if the information he brought forward in 1998 had been treated with the seriousness it deserved? Robert Pickton died on May 31, 2024, at the age of 74, at a facility in Quebec City, following a prison assault. He died having never expressed meaningful remorse for the crimes to which the evidence so comprehensively connected him. Number 4. Bruce McArthur, the Toronto landscaper whose victims' friends refused to wait. Bruce Donald McArthur was 66 years old when he took the life of his first confirmed victim in September 2010, which places him among the oldest serial killers to begin a documented pattern of offenses in recorded North American criminal history. He was born on October 8, 1951, in the small Ontario town of Argyll, and spent his adult life building what appeared to everyone around him to be an entirely ordinary existence. He worked for years as a traveling salesman, married and had children, and later, following his divorce, came out as a gay man and built a new social life centered on Toronto's Gay Village, the Church and Wellesley neighborhood that served as the cultural and social heart of the city's LGBTQ community. By the time he began committing his offenses, McArthur had transitioned to work as a self-employed landscaper, a role that gave him independent access to the properties of clients across Toronto's residential neighborhoods, including the use of large garden spaces and storage areas that his clients trusted him to manage freely. He was known in the community as a warm and sociable presence. He had worked during the Christmas season as a mall Santa, a detail that struck observers in retrospect with a particularly jarring irony. And he was an active participant in the social life of the gay village, regularly attending bars and community events, and making use of dating apps to meet men. Nothing in his public presentation suggested to anyone who encountered him that he was capable of what he was doing in private. The men who became McArthur's victims were part of the same social world he inhabited. Men connected to Toronto's gay village community, many of them immigrants from South Asia and the Middle East. Men who shared overlapping social circles and who in several cases knew each other or moved through the same spaces. Skandaraj Navaratnam, a 40-year-old man who had been in a relationship with McArthur for several years before his disappearance in September 2010, was the first. Abdul Basir Faizi vanished in 2012. Majid Kayhan disappeared that same year. Salim Essen went missing in 2017. Dean Lisowick, Soroush Mahmoodi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, and finally Andrew Kinsman in June 2017. 8 men in total, all connected in some way to the same neighborhood, the same social networks, and ultimately to the same man. The community noticed. For years, members of Toronto's gay village raised concerns with police that something was wrong, that men were disappearing at a rate and in a pattern that warranted serious investigative attention. Police did undertake some investigation. In 2012, a task force designated Project Houston examined the disappearances of Navaratnam, Faizi, and Kayhan. And during the course of that investigation, Bruce McArthur was actually identified and questioned by detectives as a person of interest. Without sufficient evidence to proceed, he was released. The investigation ultimately concluded without identifying a suspect, and McArthur returned to his life and his work and his victims. It was the disappearance of Andrew Kinsman in June 2017 that changed everything. And what changed it was the speed and determination of Andrew Kinsman's friends. Kinsman, 49 years old, was a well-connected and widely beloved figure in the gay village community. On June 26, 2017, the day after attending Pride festivities in Toronto, he went missing. His friends noticed his absence almost immediately. They observed that his cat had been left unattended and that his prescription medications, which he took regularly, had not been collected. These details told his close friends that something was genuinely wrong. Kinsman would not have left his cat without care or gone without his medications voluntarily. His friends reported him missing to police on June 29, 2017, just 72 hours after he was last seen. The speed of that report proved to be absolutely critical. Detective Sergeant Hank Idsinga of the Toronto Police Service later stated explicitly and publicly that if Andrew Kinsman had not been reported missing within that 72-hour window, investigators would have missed the piece of evidence that led them directly to Bruce McArthur. That evidence was a calendar. Inside Kinsman's apartment, investigators found his personal calendar. On the page for June 26, 2017, the precise day he vanished, was a single handwritten entry. The name written there was Bruce. The calendar entry was enough to direct investigative attention toward a specific individual. Police then pulled surveillance footage from cameras in Kinsman's neighborhood and found what they were looking for: footage showing Andrew Kinsman walking toward and entering a red Dodge Caravan in the period consistent with his disappearance. The vehicle was identified as registered to Bruce McArthur. Police began conducting surveillance on McArthur immediately. They identified multiple properties he visited as part of his landscaping business and sought judicial authorization to search them. On January 17, 2018, the investigation reached its decisive moment. Police were monitoring McArthur and executed a search warrant at his apartment, where they found a young man restrained. A man who had met McArthur through a dating app and was in a condition that made it clear he had narrowly escaped becoming another victim. McArthur was arrested on January 18, 2018. He was 66 years old at the time of his arrest. The searches that followed McArthur's arrest produced evidence of staggering scope. Officers examined dozens of properties he had maintained as a landscaper, deploying cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar across the residential sites he had worked. The most significant discovery came at a property on Mallory Crescent in Toronto's Leaside neighborhood, where McArthur had an arrangement with the elderly residents to store his landscaping equipment in exchange for free lawn care. Buried in large decorative garden planters on that property, planters that McArthur had full control over as part of his regular work, investigators found the remains of multiple victims, dismembered and concealed within the soil. Additional remains were recovered from a nearby ravine. DNA analysis linked the recovered material to the missing persons cases extending back to 2010, establishing the full scope of McArthur's offenses over a 7-year period. Evidence recovered from McArthur's electronic devices included photographs, some taken while the victims were still alive, others taken after their deaths, in which the men were posed and staged. Images that the prosecution described as evidence of a killer who exercised a desire for control and domination not only during his offenses, but in their aftermath. Investigators also recovered jewelry and a notebook that McArthur had kept as personal mementos of his crimes. The red Dodge Caravan, in which Kinsman had been seen on surveillance footage, was located at a scrapyard, and inside the vehicle, forensic investigators found DNA evidence matching both Andrew Kinsman and Salim Essen. The charges accumulated as each identification was confirmed: 8 counts of first-degree murder, corresponding to the deaths of Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kayhan, Salim Essen, Andrew Kinsman, Dean Lisowick, Soroush Mahmoudi, and Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. On January 29, 2019, Bruce McArthur appeared before the court and pleaded guilty to all 8 counts. The guilty plea spared the families, the community, and the court system the additional ordeal of a prolonged public trial, a factor that Justice John McMahon noted as a mitigating consideration in his sentencing deliberations. The prosecution had sought consecutive life sentences, which would have permanently foreclosed any possibility of parole. The defense argued for concurrent terms. Justice McMahon sentenced McArthur to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, meaning McArthur would not be eligible to apply for release until he was 91 years old, a threshold that rendered the parole eligibility date effectively academic. The judge acknowledged that there could be no true closure from crimes of this magnitude, but expressed the hope that the 8 convictions would assist the community in beginning a process of healing. The reaction outside the courtroom was complex and not universally accepting of the outcome. Nicole Borthwick, a close friend of victims Andrew Kinsman, Dean Lisowick, and Selim Essen, spoke directly to media after the sentencing and said plainly that she was not satisfied. "There is no closure, there is no grace," she said. "This community is broken, and is broken for a long time." Her words reflected the broader sentiment of a community that had been raising concerns about missing men for years, had seen those concerns initially treated with insufficient urgency, and was now confronted with the confirmation that those concerns had been entirely justified. The Toronto Police Service subsequently commissioned an independent review of its handling of the missing persons reports related to the Gay Village disappearances, acknowledging that questions about whether earlier action could have been taken were legitimate and warranted examination. The case of Bruce McArthur stands as a powerful illustration of how quickly an investigation can move when the right piece of information reaches the right people in time, and as a sobering reminder of what can happen in the years before that information arrives. Number 5. Arthur Shawcross, the Genesee River Killer, caught through his girlfriend's van and a piece of stolen jewelry. Arthur John Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine, and grew up in Watertown, a small city in northern New York State near the eastern shore of Lake Ontario. His childhood, by his own account, was marked by abuse and dysfunction, though the specific claims he made about his early experiences, including allegations of severe mistreatment, were disputed by his parents and could not be independently verified. What is not disputed is that Shawcross developed into a deeply troubled young person who failed to complete high school, dropping out in the 9th grade, and who exhibited behavioral problems serious enough to leave an impression on those around him from an early age. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1964 and served in Vietnam, an experience he would later draw upon extensively in the psychological portrait he offered courts and evaluators, claiming, among other things, experiences of extreme violence overseas. These claims, like many of the narratives Shawcross constructed about his life, could not be verified and were viewed with significant skepticism by forensic experts. He married 4 times over the course of his adult years, but none of his marriages lasted, each ending as his wives encountered and could no longer tolerate the volatility and unpredictability of his behavior. The first confirmed entries in Shawcross's criminal record were catastrophic. In May 1972, in Watertown, he took the life of 10-year-old Jake Blake. Later that same year, he took the life of 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill. He was arrested, confessed, and pleaded guilty to manslaughter in connection with one of the child deaths, an outcome that prosecutors and the public later found shockingly inadequate given the nature of what he had done. He received a 25-year sentence. He served less than 15 years before being granted parole in April 1987. The decision to release Shawcross after such a comparatively brief period of incarceration would become one of the most heavily criticized decisions in New York State correctional history. Adding to the severity of that failure was what happened next. The parole officer responsible for managing Shawcross's release failed to notify the Rochester law enforcement community that a convicted child killer was being relocated to their city. His records were effectively obscured to prevent public knowledge of his identity and history, a protective measure that left the Rochester Police Department entirely in the dark about who had just moved into their jurisdiction. Shawcross settled in Rochester in 1987, found a series of menial jobs, and began living with a woman named Rose Woolley. He also developed a relationship with another woman in the area named Clara Neal, who became his mistress and who would, in a direct and decisive way, bring about his eventual capture. By the spring of 1988, Arthur Shawcross had begun killing again. His victims in Rochester were predominantly women engaged in sex work, women living in precarious circumstances whose disappearances, as had been the pattern in the Pickton case years later in Canada, were not initially treated with the investigative urgency they deserved. His first victim after his release from prison was 27-year-old Dorothy Blackburn, whose remains were found in the Genesee River on March 24, 1988. The Genesee River, running through the heart of Rochester on its way to Lake Ontario, would become the site of discovery for multiple victims and would ultimately lend Shawcross his criminal designation. Anna Steffen, 28 years old, was found in September 1988. Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, Frances Brown, June Stotts, Marie Welch, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, Felicia Stevens, women found in and around Rochester and along the banks of the Genesee across a span of almost 2 years, killed with a consistency of method, strangulation, primarily, that reflected the same pattern Shawcross had employed in his initial 1972 offenses. Elizabeth Gibson was found in the neighboring Wayne County, making her legally distinct from the other cases for jurisdictional reasons. The others fell within Monroe County. Investigators were aware that women were dying in Rochester and that the cases bore similarities to each other, but building a definitive picture of a single responsible party proved extraordinarily difficult. Forensic technology in the late 1980s lacked the capabilities that modern investigators take for granted, and the jurisdictional and communication challenges facing law enforcement agencies of that era compounded the difficulty. A psychological profile of the likely offender was developed and provided to investigators, and it shaped the tactical decision that ultimately ended Shawcross's killing span. The final confirmed victim of Shawcross's Rochester offenses was June Cicero, whose remains were discovered on January 2, 1990. Rather than immediately removing the body from the scene, investigators made a deliberate choice. The profile suggested that this type of offender would be likely to return to the location of a recently placed victim. Police kept the site under surveillance. They were right. On January 2, 1990, a police helicopter conducting aerial surveillance of the area spotted a man sitting in a vehicle near the location where Cicero's remains had been found, eating a lunch he had apparently brought with him. The vehicle was traced through its registration to Clara Neal, Arthur Shawcross's girlfriend. Officers went directly to Neal's address, and the quiet, unremarkable-seeming man they encountered there was Arthur John Shawcross. Brought in for questioning, Shawcross initially refused to acknowledge any involvement in the deaths. What broke his silence was a piece of evidence that investigators had been holding, a piece of jewelry that Clara Neal had in her possession, which was identified as having belonged to June Cicero. Police informed Shawcross that if he did not cooperate, they would move to implicate Neal herself in the crimes. The tactic worked. Shawcross began to talk. What followed was one of the most extensive confessions in New York State criminal history, an 80-page transcript in which Shawcross provided accounts of his offenses, attributing many of them to provocations by the victims, claims that investigators and the prosecution dismissed entirely as self-serving fabrications. The confession confirmed not only the Rochester killings but also extended the full accounting of his criminal record, establishing the complete scope of a man who had spent much of his adult life either incarcerated or killing. He was formally arrested on January 5, 1990. The trial that followed in November 1990 was a national media event. Shawcross was tried on 10 of the murder counts in Monroe County. The Elizabeth Gibson case was handled separately in Wayne County. The defense mounted an elaborate argument for mitigation, presenting expert testimony about Shawcross's claimed childhood trauma, alleged post-traumatic stress from his military service, a brain cyst identified in medical imaging, and a rare chromosomal condition, an extra Y chromosome, that defense experts argued was associated with heightened aggression. The prosecution countered each of these arguments systematically, presenting evidence that the claimed mitigating factors were either unverifiable, medically overstated, or irrelevant to the legal standard for criminal responsibility. The jury was not persuaded by the defense's portrait of a man diminished by circumstance. They convicted Shawcross on all 10 counts of second-degree murder in Monroe County. He subsequently pleaded guilty to the Elizabeth Gibson murder in Wayne County, adding an 11th murder conviction to his record. The sentences imposed amounted to a cumulative term of 250 years. At that time, the longest sentence ever handed down in New York State, with no possibility of parole. He was transported to the New York State Correctional System to serve that sentence. Shawcross spent the rest of his life in prison, during which time he gave extensive interviews to journalists, researchers, and forensic psychologists, and wrote correspondence that was later published and analyzed in academic contexts. He made various additional claims about his history and his motivations over the years, many of which investigators and experts found implausible or impossible to verify. He died on November 10, 2008, at Albany Medical Center, after being transferred from the Sullivan Correctional Facility, where he had been incarcerated. He was 63 years old. The cause of death was identified as complications from medical conditions he had been experiencing. The case of Arthur Shawcross carries within it two distinct and equally important cautionary elements: the catastrophic consequences of releasing a violent offender without adequate notification to the community receiving him, and the extraordinary significance of the mundane: a vehicle registration in a girlfriend's name, a piece of borrowed or taken jewelry, a lunch eaten near the wrong location. These small, overlooked details were what Clara Neal's name on a van and a piece of June Cicero's jewelry represented. Threads that, once pulled, unraveled everything. Number 6. Edward Wayne Edwards, the reformed criminal whose own daughter finally told the truth about him. Edward Wayne Edwards was born Charles Wayne Murray on June 14, 1933, in Akron, Ohio, into a life that was defined almost from its first moments by loss and instability. When he was approximately 2 years old, he witnessed the death of his mother by suicide, a foundational trauma that shaped the psychological landscape of his early years in ways that would only become fully apparent decades later. Without a parent to care for him, Edwards was placed in an orphanage, where he remained for a significant portion of his childhood, and where, by his own account and later reports from his daughter, he endured mistreatment and neglect. The institutional setting did nothing to provide the stability or attachment that a young child requires to develop into a functional adult. Edwards emerged from that environment with a criminal orientation that manifested quickly and escalated steadily. By the 1950s, he was committing armed robberies of gas stations across multiple states, a pattern of offending that eventually placed him on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, a distinction that, paradoxically, would later become part of the extraordinary public persona he constructed for himself. He was captured, served time, and was eventually paroled. What made Edward Wayne Edwards one of the most disorienting figures in American true crime history was not the scope of his confirmed crimes, but the life he built alongside and around them. After his parole in the late 1960s, Edwards underwent what appeared to all outward observers to be a genuine and comprehensive transformation. He married. He became a father. He wrote a memoir about his life of crime and his apparent reformation. He made appearances on national television game shows, including To Tell the Truth and What's My Line, presenting himself as a reformed criminal who had turned his life around and was now a voice for rehabilitation and redemption. He became, to the people who encountered him in this persona, a compelling and persuasive speaker, a man who seemed to embody the possibility that even the most troubled individual could change. His daughter April, who grew up knowing the charming, charismatic, socially skilled version of her father, described him to People magazine as well-liked by everyone who met him, someone who inserted himself easily into communities wherever the family lived, someone who befriended law enforcement officers and positioned himself as a trustworthy local figure. He was, in April's words, a man who understood people and knew how to earn their confidence. But April Bellaccio also remembered other things about her father. She remembered the unexplained, abrupt relocations, the nights when the family would move without warning, packing up and leaving a town behind with no explanation given to the children. She remembered that, wherever they lived, there always seemed to be a murder. She remembered, specifically, a day in 1980 when her father came home in the early morning hours with a different demeanor than usual, cleaned his boots in a way that struck her as deliberate and careful, and then loaded the family into the car and drove them away from their home in Wisconsin without explanation. She was a child then, and she filed the memory away in that part of the mind where children store the things that trouble them, but that they have no framework to process. "Kids aren't stupid," she said years later. "Someone was always murdered wherever we lived." The knowledge sat inside her for decades, formless and unconfirmed, the suspicion of a child that had never become the certainty of an adult. The victims who framed the confirmed scope of Edwards's crimes came into focus through the painstaking work of investigators and the eventual courage of his daughter. In August 1977, Edwards approached a young couple in a park in Norton, Ohio, 21-year-old William Lavaco and 18-year-old Judith Straub, and shot them both, then staged the scene to appear as if one had killed the other in a murder-suicide. The staging was enough to confuse the initial investigation, and the case remained unresolved for decades. Then came the crime that April Bellacio's memory was anchored to. In the summer of 1980, 19-year-old Timothy Hack and 18-year-old Kelly Drew, a young couple, attended a wedding reception at the Concord House, a dance hall in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. They left together and were never seen alive again. Their remains were found separately, and the case entered the Wisconsin Cold Case Files, the so-called Sweetheart Murders, where it would remain for nearly 30 years. In 1996, in Burton, Ohio, Edwards committed what would prove to be his final confirmed offense. He lured his 25-year-old foster son, Danny Law Glockner, known as Danny Boy, into the woods and took his life, burying him in a shallow grave. The motive, established through Edwards's later confession, was to collect a $250,000 life insurance policy he had taken out on his foster son. The moment that unraveled Edwards's decades of concealment came in 2009, when Wisconsin investigators, working on the Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew cold case, decided to take a different approach. Detective Chad Garcia's team reopened the investigation and made the decision to release information about the case publicly, including details about the Concord House dance hall where the couple had last been seen, in the hope that someone in the public might recognize something. The story was covered in regional news broadcasts and online. April Bellaccio, by then 48 years old, and living with the accumulated weight of decades of unresolved suspicion about her father, saw the coverage. She began reading, and when she saw the reference to the Concord House, she stopped. "I started hyperventilating," she later told People, "because that was the moment it really hit me, that my dad was the horrible, horrible person that I'd always suspected him of. I just never had the proof." She recognized the location. Her family had been near that area in 1980, and she knew, as certainly as she had ever known anything, that the memory of her father cleaning his boots in the early hours of that morning was connected to what she was now reading. She called Detective Garcia. She told him what she knew and what she had suspected for most of her life. Within months of April Bellaccio's tip to investigators, DNA evidence was recovered and tested. The results confirmed a match connecting Edwards to the Hack and Drew murders. He was arrested on July 30, 2009, in Jefferson County, Ohio, at the age of 75. Confronted with the DNA evidence, Edwards began to confess, and the confessions expanded the picture significantly. He admitted to the 1980 Wisconsin killings of Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew. He admitted to the 1977 Ohio killings of William Lavaco and Judith Straub. He admitted to the 1996 murder of his foster son Danny Boy Glockner. In Wisconsin, he received 2 life sentences for the Hack and Drew murders. In Ohio, he was convicted of additional charges and sentenced to death for the murder of Danny Boy Glockner, with a sentencing date established for March 2011. He died of natural causes in prison on April 7, 2011, at the age of 77, before that execution could be carried out. April Bellaccio has spoken publicly and at length about the experience of growing up as the daughter of a man she now understands to have been a serial killer hiding in plain sight, the shame she felt, the guilt by association she feared, the years it took her to process what her childhood had actually contained. She has written a memoir, Raised by a Serial Killer, Discovering the Truth About My Father, in which she documents both the specific memories and the broader psychological experience of living in proximity to a person whose public persona bore no relationship to his private reality. Her decision to call Detective Garcia is described by investigators and legal commentators who have studied the case as an act of singular moral courage. A woman who turned in her own father for crimes she had suspected but could not prove, at tremendous personal cost to herself and her sense of family, because she understood that the families of Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew and the others deserved to know the truth. The people who knew Edwards as a charismatic reformed criminal, as a motivational speaker, as a friendly neighbor who got along well with law enforcement, could not believe what his daughter's call revealed. He was well liked. He was very charismatic, April said. And that's why when I turned him in, people that we knew just couldn't believe it. They were shocked. Number 7. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the grim sleeper unmasked by his own son's DNA. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born in August 1952 in South Central Los Angeles, the neighborhood in which he would spend virtually his entire life and in which he would eventually become the most prolific and long-running serial predator the area had ever produced. He grew up in the community, worked in it, raised his family in it, and was known there in the way that long-established residents are known in tight-knit urban neighborhoods, as a familiar face, a neighbor, someone people could identify and place. For years, Franklin worked as a mechanic for the Los Angeles Police Department's garage operation, a job that gave him both economic stability and, in a deeply ironic structural sense, a daily proximity to the very institution that would one day be hunting him. He also worked for the city of Los Angeles as a trash collector before retiring on disability in February 1989 following a shoulder injury. He lived in a house on 81st Street near Western Avenue in South Los Angeles, the center of the geographic area where all of the women connected to his crimes would eventually be found. He kept photographs, he kept a weapon, he kept trophies of what he had done in the same house where he lived with his family, in the same neighborhood where he was known as the neighborhood mechanic, as a friendly and ordinary presence. The community he had built his life inside of had no idea. The killings that would eventually be attributed to Lonnie Franklin Jr. began in 1985 and were characterized from the beginning by a consistency of method and geography that pointed clearly, for investigators who were paying attention, toward a single responsible party. His confirmed victims were women, predominantly young black women, some of whom struggled with addiction, some of whom engaged in sex work, some of whom were simply women living in South Los Angeles in circumstances that the city's social infrastructure had failed to adequately support. The first confirmed victim, Deborah Jackson, was 29 years old when she was found in August 1985. The killings continued through 1988, with the bodies of additional women, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, LaCrika Jefferson, and others, found across a concentrated geographic area of South Los Angeles. The method was consistent. Franklin used a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol as his primary weapon, and the DNA evidence recovered from the bodies provided a biological thread connecting the cases to a single unknown offender. But in the late 1980s, the capabilities of forensic DNA analysis were limited, and the investigative resources directed toward the deaths of women in South Central Los Angeles were, by the assessment of community advocates and later critics of the investigation, insufficient to the scale of what was actually occurring. In 1988, the killings apparently stopped. For investigators following the pattern, this pause was confusing. One theory was that the responsible party had been incarcerated. Another was that he had relocated. What actually happened during the gap of approximately 14 years, a pause that lasted from 1988 until approximately 2002, was never definitively established. It may have been that a survivor in November 1988, a woman who was assaulted and left for dead but lived, caused Franklin to pull back out of concern that his pattern had become visible. Whatever the reason, the crimes went quiet. And then, beginning in 2002, they resumed. Valerie McCorvey, Princess Berthomew, Genesee Peters, women found in South Los Angeles in the first years of the new century, connected by DNA to the same offender responsible for the killings of the 1980s. It was a reporter from LA Weekly who gave the unknown offender the name by which he would become publicly identified, the Grim Sleeper, a reference to the long apparent pause in his activity between the two clusters of killings. The name stuck, and it became the organizing identity around which investigators and the public understood the scope of what they were dealing with. By 2007, when 25-year-old Genesee Peters was found in South Los Angeles, the lab had accumulated decades of DNA evidence linked to a single unidentified profile, but had been unable, through conventional database matching, to identify the person behind it. The forensic record was extensive and coherent. The same biological signature appeared across cases spanning more than 2 decades. But without a name to match it to, the investigation had reached an impasse. Investigators then pursued an approach that was, at the time, genuinely novel in California criminal jurisprudence: familial DNA searching. Rather than looking for an exact match to the crime scene DNA profile in the state database, investigators sought permission to search for profiles that bore the strong but imperfect similarity characteristic of close biological relatives. The technique required specific legal authorization and was intensely debated on privacy grounds, but investigators made the case that in a violent serial murder investigation that had exhausted all conventional avenues, familial searching was justified. Authorization was granted. The search was run. The result came back in early 2010. The familial match identified a young man named Christopher Franklin, who had been arrested in November 2008 on a felony weapons charge and whose DNA had been entered into the California state database upon his conviction. Christopher Franklin was too young to have committed the crimes of the 1980s, but his DNA shared the distinctive markers of a close biological relative of the Grim Sleeper. Public records searches revealed that Christopher's father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., was the right age, had not been incarcerated or out of the country during any of the confirmed killings, and lived at 1728 81st Street, precisely at the center of the geographic area where every victim had been found. California District Attorney Steve Cooley later described the Grim Sleeper case as the first in California history in which a familial DNA search had been used successfully to identify a murder suspect. The use of Christopher Franklin's DNA, obtained through a wholly unrelated criminal case, through a conviction his father played no role in, had inadvertently given investigators the key they had been searching for across 2.5 decades. What followed was a model of covert investigative patience. Rather than immediately confronting or arresting Franklin, investigators established a discreet surveillance operation beginning in July 2010 and waited for an opportunity to obtain his DNA without alerting him to their interest. On July 5, 2010, Franklin attended a family birthday celebration at a pizza restaurant in Orange County. An undercover officer, positioned within the restaurant as a busboy, unobtrusively collected items that Franklin had used during his meal: a half-eaten slice of pizza, a fork, 2 napkins, 2 plastic cups, and a piece of chocolate cake. These items were delivered to the crime laboratory, where DNA analysis confirmed that the biological profile recovered from Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s discarded food and utensils was a match to the profile recovered from the victims of the Grim Sleeper killings. On the morning of July 7, 2010, undercover officers approached Franklin as he left his house on 81st Street and arrested him without incident. He made no attempt to resist. By 10 in the morning, the street was cordoned off, and 6 forensic teams had begun searching his home and garage. Among the more than 900 items removed from the property was a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol that was later identified as the weapon used to kill Genesee Peters in 2007, and a collection of photographs of women, many of them victims, or potential victims, that Franklin had kept in his home for years. The trial that followed stretched across several months and resulted in a jury deliberating for a single day before returning a verdict. On May 5, 2016, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, covering crimes committed between 1985 and 2007. At the sentencing phase of the proceedings, the jury recommended the death penalty. On August 10, 2016, Judge Kathleen Kennedy formally sentenced Franklin to death. He arrived at San Quentin State Prison's death row on August 17, 2016. He died on death row in March 2020, found unresponsive in his cell at the age of 67. No evidence of trauma was identified at the time. The Marin County coroner determined that his death was the result of natural causes. He died without having spoken publicly about his crimes in any meaningful way, having maintained silence throughout the trial, broken only once, when he appeared to mouth, "I've never seen you before in my life," to the sister of one of his victims, and leaving whatever understanding he might have provided of his motivations entirely beyond reach. The community of South Los Angeles, which had been raising concerns about the pattern of disappearances and deaths for years, and which had seen those concerns treated by investigators and civic leadership with inadequate urgency, expressed through advocates and victims' family members a grief that was inseparable from anger. Community members and the families of the victims were direct in their assessment that the prolonged failure to identify and stop the Grim Sleeper was connected to institutional biases about whose deaths warranted sustained investigative resources, the same criticism that had been leveled at law enforcement institutions in the Pickton case in Canada and in multiple other cases involving marginalized victims. The use of familial DNA searching, which became more widely adopted across the country in the years following the Franklin case, was simultaneously celebrated as a forensic breakthrough and debated as a privacy policy question. A tool of extraordinary investigative power, whose application to the biological profiles of people who have not themselves been accused of any crime raises legal and ethical questions that courts and legislators continue to navigate. Christopher Franklin, whose DNA became the inadvertent key to exposing his father, played no knowing role in what that DNA revealed about the man who raised him. Number 8. John Edward Robinson, the Slavemaster whose victims' loved ones refused to accept his explanations. John Edward Robinson Sr. presents one of the most comprehensive examples in criminal history of a fraudster whose entire existence was an extended performance. A man who spent decades constructing false identities, fabricating credentials, and deceiving everyone around him while accumulating a criminal record that, had anyone ever assembled it in its entirety at a sufficiently early moment, might have prevented the deaths of multiple women. He was born in Cicero, Illinois, in 1943, and from his earliest adult years demonstrated a facility for persuasion, an aptitude for identifying what people wanted to hear, and a complete absence of the internal constraints that prevent most people from acting on deceptive or harmful impulses. His criminal history before the murders that eventually brought him to justice included fraud, theft, embezzlement, and schemes to deceive employers, financial institutions, and individuals across multiple states. He was a man who had worked as a physician's assistant using fraudulent credentials, who had been convicted of swindling and served probation, who had been charged with fraud in connection with a purported business venture, and who had developed across decades an expertise in presenting himself as a legitimate, respectable businessman with resources, authority, and opportunity to offer the people he was targeting. He married, had children, and maintained the surface structure of a family man while conducting a simultaneous existence that was hidden from virtually everyone who knew him in his legitimate life. By the 1990s, Robinson had discovered the early internet and specifically the online BDSM communities that had developed on it. Communities built around consensual bondage and submission dynamics, frequented by people who were often explicit about their desires and who could be found, contacted, and engaged through the relative anonymity that early internet communication provided. Robinson created an online persona under the name Slavemaster and began cultivating relationships with women he identified in these communities, presenting himself as a wealthy, sophisticated man with a genuine interest in long-term power exchange relationships, offering employment, financial stability, travel, and the kinds of elaborate lifestyle promises that could be enormously appealing to a person in difficult circumstances. The women he targeted were invariably people he had assessed as vulnerable, women with financial difficulties, women who were socially isolated, women who had reason to want the kind of fresh start that Robinson's fabricated propositions appeared to represent. Among his confirmed victims were women whose fates illuminate the full scope of his methods. Lisa Stasi was a young mother, 19 years old, who disappeared in 1985 after Robinson offered her assistance through a charitable organization he claimed to run. Her infant daughter, Tiffany, was handed over by Robinson to his brother Donald and Donald's wife, who adopted the child and raised her without knowing anything about the circumstances of her mother's death. Beverly Bonner, a librarian who had worked in a Kansas prison where Robinson briefly served time, was offered by him a business partnership and a new opportunity after her divorce. She disappeared in 1994, and Robinson continued to cash her pension and disability checks for years after her death, a pattern of fraud that left a paper trail investigators would eventually trace. Sheila Faith and her daughter Debbie, who used a wheelchair following a spinal injury, came to Robinson after he offered Sheila a relationship and the promise of support. Both disappeared in 1994, and Robinson continued cashing Debbie's disability payments for years. Isabella Luica, a 21-year-old Polish immigrant studying in the United States, was offered by Robinson an internship at a publishing company he claimed to operate, a relationship, and a future together. She disappeared in 1999 after signing what Robinson presented as a slave contract, a 115-item document that assigned Robinson complete legal and personal authority over her life. She was 22 years old when she died. The chain of events that finally broke Robinson's protective scaffolding began with Suzette Troughton, a practical nurse from Michigan who in early 2000 traveled to Kansas after Robinson offered her a position traveling the world with him as his live-in companion, along with a $60,000 annual salary to care for his elderly father. After Suzette arrived in Kansas and spent time in Robinson's control, she stopped communicating with her family in the ways they were accustomed to. Letters began arriving, typewritten, postmarked consistently from Kansas City rather than the international locations they purported to come from, and notably free of the spelling errors and idiosyncratic punctuation that Suzette's mother Carolyn recognized as characteristic of her daughter's writing style. Carolyn Troughton found the letters strange. She found Robinson's subsequent phone calls, in which he told her that Suzette had run off with another man and stolen money from him, entirely inconsistent with what she knew of her daughter's character and their relationship. Carolyn and her other daughter Dawn contacted the Overland Park Police Department in Kansas and reported their concerns. What they discovered when they reached investigators was that Robinson was already under scrutiny. His name had begun appearing in connection with multiple missing persons reports in both Kansas and Missouri, and a task force involving law enforcement agencies from both states had been quietly developing a picture of the same man appearing at the center of too many disappearances. The arrest came in June 2000, triggered by complaints from two women who had engaged with Robinson through online BDSM communities. One filed a sexual battery complaint against him. The other reported that Robinson had stolen her personal belongings, including items related to their arrangement. The theft complaint provided investigators with the probable cause they needed to execute search warrants on his properties. Officers went first to Robinson's 17-acre farm near La Cygne, Kansas, where they found 2 chemical drums stored beside a shed. Inside those drums were the remains of Isabella Lewitka and Suzette Troughton. Missouri investigators simultaneously searched a storage facility where Robinson rented a unit and found 3 additional chemical drums. Inside were the remains of Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Debbie Faith. All 5 women had been killed by blunt force trauma applied twice to the head. The subsequent investigation traced Robinson's crimes back through the 1980s, establishing connections to Lisa Stasi and to other women who had been in contact with him over 15 years of escalating offenses. The discovery that Tiffany Stasi, Lisa's infant daughter, had been living all along with Robinson's own brother, adopted under circumstances that Robinson had engineered, added a dimension of manipulation that extended into his immediate family circle in ways that had been invisible for 15 years. The trial that followed in Olathe, Kansas, beginning in October 2002, became the longest criminal trial in Kansas history. Robinson faced 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of Suzette Troughton and Isabella Lewitka, and a first-degree premeditated murder charge for Lisa Stasi, whose body was never recovered. He pleaded not guilty on all counts. After 3 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the jury convicted him on all counts. For the murders of Troughton and Lewitka, Robinson received the death penalty. For the murder of Lisa Stasi, tried under the law as it existed at the time of her death, before Kansas reinstated the death penalty, he received life imprisonment. Additional sentences were imposed for his interference with the parental custody of Lisa Stasi's infant daughter, for kidnapping, and for theft. In Missouri, rather than face a second lengthy trial, Robinson eventually entered a plea arrangement in connection with the remaining murders, receiving additional life sentences. He remains on death row in Kansas, awaiting execution, a state in which he has existed for more than 20 years, his appeals winding through the court system as the families of his victims have continued to seek final resolution. The Troughton family's role in this outcome is both deeply personal and structurally significant. Carolyn Troughton's decision to call police when Robinson's account of her daughter's disappearance did not match what she knew of Suzette's character, and to push for that complaint to be taken seriously in the face of Robinson's confident counter-narrative provided the investigative foothold that allowed the full scope of his crimes to emerge. She was not the only person close to Robinson's victims to raise concerns, but her complaint, combined with the 2 women who filed criminal reports against him in 2000, provided the specific legal basis for the search warrants that opened his farm and his storage unit to scrutiny. The case of John Edward Robinson is one in which the internet, the same medium he used to identify and cultivate his victims, ultimately provided investigators with a trail of communications, financial transactions, and contacts that made the construction of a complete evidentiary picture possible. It is also a case in which the people who knew his victims best, who knew how they wrote their letters, who knew their characters, who recognized when the story they were being told did not match the person they knew, provided the human intelligence that law enforcement could not have generated on its own. Number 9. Larry Eyler, the highway killer whose closest companion testified against him at trial. Larry William Eyler was born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, the son of George Howard Eyler and Shirley Phyllis Kennedy, and grew up in circumstances that he and those who later examined his background described as characterized by instability and violence. He dropped out of high school during his senior year, eventually earning his GED. He struggled with the tensions of a personal identity, his homosexuality, that in the rural Midwest of the 1970s was not something that could be openly acknowledged without social consequences, and he navigated this identity through a pattern of relationships and encounters that he kept separate from whatever version of his life he presented to the world around him. He eventually settled in the Terre Haute, Indiana area, where he developed a close friendship and intimate relationship with an older, professionally established man named Robert David Little, who worked as a professor and chairman of the Department of Library Science at Indiana State University. Little was 53 years old and occupied a position of social and professional respectability that contrasted sharply with the nature of his involvement with Eyler, an involvement that would become one of the most contested and disturbing dimensions of the entire case. Eyler also had another significant person in his private life, a man named John Dobrovolskis, who served as his apartment roommate and longtime lover. It was from within this triangle of personal connections that the evidence against Larry Eyler would ultimately emerge and be presented to the jury that convicted him. The killings attributed to Eyler began in October 1982 and continued through August 1984, spanning a geographic corridor that ran across Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and into Kentucky, a swath of highway-connected Midwest countryside in which young men, predominantly gay or suspected to be gay, were found stabbed to death and left in fields, ditches, and rural areas along or near interstate routes. The victims were typically encountered by Eyler at truck stops, through hitchhiking, through personal advertisements, or at establishments associated with gay social life. He drove extensively across state lines in the course of his killing, and the multi-jurisdictional nature of the crimes created precisely the kind of investigative fragmentation that serial killers operating along transit routes had historically exploited. Different counties, different states, different law enforcement databases, no centralized system capable of recognizing the pattern across the jurisdictional borders. A multi-state task force was eventually assembled to address the pattern, but it operated under significant constraints, and Eyler used the legal challenges available to him to protect himself even after investigators had identified him as a serious suspect. The task force first brought significant legal attention to Eyler in September 1983, when a state trooper in Lake County, Indiana, Kenneth Burley, stopped a vehicle that Eyler was driving, in which he had a passenger, after observing the car parked illegally on the interstate. The stop and the search that followed turned up evidence that investigators believed was directly relevant to the murders, including items associated with restraint. Eyler was identified as a serious suspect, and the evidence gathered during the stop and subsequent searches was entered into the legal process. But at a suppression hearing that convened in January 1984 before Judge William Block, the court determined that the original stop had not provided sufficient legal justification for the searches that followed. Eyler had committed no offense except illegal parking, and ruled the evidence inadmissible. The suppression of this evidence, which included boots, handcuffs, and a knife, effectively freed Eyler from the criminal exposure he had faced. He relocated from Indiana to Chicago, where he continued his offenses. The killing that finally ended Eyler's ability to evade justice was the death of 15-year-old Danny Bridges. Bridges's body was discovered on August 21, 1984, dismembered and placed in 8 separate garbage bags that had been disposed of in a dumpster at an apartment complex in Chicago. The discovery of a human limb protruding from one of the bags by a janitor named Joe Bala triggered the investigation. Fingerprints lifted from the garbage bags matched Eyler's print profile, and investigators moved immediately on his Chicago apartment. When police raided the apartment at 7 in the morning and took Eyler into custody, they found him in bed with John Dobrovolskis. The search of the apartment revealed bloodstains, a box of trash bags matching those from the alley dumpster, a hacksaw, and a shirt belonging to Danny Bridges. Eyler was charged with first-degree murder. Dobrovolskis, who was in the apartment at the time of the arrest, was briefly detained but released due to insufficient evidence against him personally. The role of John Dobrovolskis in bringing Eyler to justice unfolded across 2 separate phases of the legal proceedings. At the 1984 suppression hearing in Indiana, before the Bridges case became the central charge, Dobrovolskis appeared as a witness and provided testimony about his knowledge of Eyler's activities and the circumstances surrounding the period under examination by the court. His testimony at that stage was part of a proceeding that ultimately resulted in evidence being suppressed. But in the 1986 trial in Cook County, Illinois, for the murder of Danny Bridges, Dobrovolskis testified for the prosecution in a far more consequential capacity. He told the court about the phone calls Eyler had made to him on the night Danny Bridges disappeared. 3 calls, placed from specific locations that helped establish where Eyler had been during the relevant period. He described Eyler's behavior and activities around the time of the murder. And critically, his testimony contradicted Eyler's claimed alibi and added the kind of behavioral and contextual detail about Eyler's movements and state of mind that only someone in close personal proximity to him could have provided. The building janitors Berdicki and Bala, who saw Eyler carrying heavy bags to the dumpster, provided the physical observational testimony. Dobrovolskis provided the intimate personal knowledge, the testimony of a man who had shared an apartment and a life with the defendant, and who was willing to stand in court and tell the jury what he knew. The trial opened on July 1, 1986, in Cook County Circuit Court, before Judge Joseph Urso. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Mark Ricozzi, assembled its case around physical evidence: the fingerprints, the matching garbage bags, the items found in the apartment, the janitor's eyewitness accounts, and Dobrovolskis's testimony about Eyler's movements and communications. Robert Little, the Indiana State University professor with whom Eyler had maintained his other significant relationship, also testified, stating that he had been with Eyler on the day of Bridges's abduction but had departed for Terre Haute before the crime occurred, and denying any knowledge of or involvement in what happened to Danny Bridges. The jury convicted Eyler of all counts on July 9, 1986. The penalty phase followed, and on October 3, 1986, Judge Urso sentenced Larry Eyler to death by lethal injection. Additional sentences of 15 years for aggravated kidnapping and 5 years for concealment of a homicidal death were also imposed. Eyler remained on death row throughout subsequent years of appeals, all of which were ultimately rejected. In 1990, bargaining with Indiana prosecutors in an effort to have his death sentence reduced, he confessed to 21 murders total and made additional allegations about Robert Little's participation in at least one of them, allegations that were investigated but resulted in no charges against Little. Larry Eyler died on March 6, 1994, at the Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois. He was 41 years old. The cause of death was complications from AIDS, which he had contracted at some point during his incarceration. The death sentence that the legal system had imposed was rendered moot by the one that the virus had already delivered. Number 10. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, exposed by the DNA of strangers who were his own blood. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born in Bath, New York, in 1945, into a childhood that investigators and prosecutors described after his arrest as shaped by witness trauma, family violence, and an acute, early-formed sense of powerlessness. Witnesses and family history accounts gathered during the investigation described a boy who grew up watching the people around him suffer harm he could not prevent, and who responded to that powerlessness by developing an internal orientation toward control and domination that would eventually manifest in crimes of extraordinary scale. He graduated from Sacramento State University with a degree in criminal justice, joined the Exeter Police Department in 1973, and then moved to the Auburn Police Department, becoming, in one of the most disturbing biographical facts associated with any serial criminal in American history, a sworn officer of the law who was simultaneously operating as a serial burglar, rapist, and eventually a killer. He was fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent, a mundane and almost banal endpoint to his law enforcement career, the termination that his victims might wish had happened years sooner and under entirely different circumstances. After losing his badge, he worked for years as a supermarket stockperson in the Sacramento area, living what appeared to neighbors and acquaintances as an ordinary, unremarkable life. He had a daughter. He had grandchildren. He maintained a residence in a quiet neighborhood in Citrus Heights, California. He was, to all outward appearances, simply an older man living in retirement. Between 1974 and 1986, DeAngelo committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and 120 burglaries across 11 California counties. The scale and geographic spread of these crimes placed him across multiple investigative identities for decades. He was initially identified in the mid-1970s in Visalia, California, as an unknown perpetrator of approximately 120 burglaries in a 3-square-mile radius, the so-called Visalia ransacker, whose crimes investigators eventually connected to DeAngelo only after his identity had been established through entirely other means. In 1976, the ransacker shot and killed a journalist named Claude Snelling, who interrupted him during an attempted abduction, then escaped. Still unidentified, he relocated northward to the Sacramento area, where he began committing a pattern of residential home invasions and sexual assaults, the crimes for which he became known in law enforcement files as the East Area Rapist. In this phase of his offenses, he targeted couples in their homes at night, subduing male victims through restraint and terrorizing both partners before carrying out assaults. In 1979, the East Area Rapist extended his activity southward along California's coast, where he committed additional attacks and, for the first time in his confirmed offense history, committed murders. In this phase, he became known as the original Night Stalker, a designation kept separate from the East Area Rapist cases for more than 2 decades. It was not until 2001 that FBI investigators, using advances in DNA comparison technology, established definitively that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The unified case was then designated the Golden State Killer, a name coined by true crime author Michelle McNamara in a 2013 article that brought renewed public attention to the unsolved cases and established the cultural framework through which DeAngelo's crimes became widely known. The investigative challenge presented by the Golden State Killer cases across 4 decades was not a shortage of biological evidence. DeAngelo had left DNA at crime scenes across California, and advances in forensic DNA technology through the 1990s and 2000s had progressively improved the quality and detail of the profile generated from that evidence. The problem was that the profile, however precise, matched nothing in existing law enforcement databases. DeAngelo had no criminal conviction that would have placed his DNA in the Combined DNA Index System, the national forensic database used by American law enforcement, and his firearm from the Auburn shoplifting incident had never generated a DNA record. The conventional route to identifying an unknown offender through DNA match was closed. Investigators who had spent years and in some cases decades trying to solve the Golden State Killer cases faced the prospect that the biological evidence in their possession might never be connected to a name through standard forensic channels. The approach that broke the case was the work of genetic genealogist CeCe Moore, who had developed and refined a technique she called reverse genealogy, and who was engaged by investigators in 2017 to apply that technique to the Golden State Killer's DNA profile. The method began with converting the crime scene DNA into a genetic profile compatible with the format used by public genealogy databases, platforms like GEDmatch, to which people submit their DNA voluntarily in order to find and connect with biological relatives. Moore then uploaded the converted profile and searched for partial matches, the partial, imperfect similarities that indicate not an exact match to the suspect, but rather the presence of biological relatives in the database who share portions of the same genetic inheritance. Distant cousins, third-degree relatives, people who had no idea they were related to a serial killer and no idea their DNA was being used to build a family tree around a 40-year-old crime scene profile. The partial matches provided anchors. Moore then worked backward and outward from those anchors, through decades of genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries, social media profiles, public records of every kind, constructing family trees that reached across generations and narrowed the potential suspects progressively through a combination of genetic proximity, age, location, and physical description consistency. The process was extraordinarily painstaking, involving the construction of enormous family trees that eventually converged on a narrowing pool of candidates. One of those candidates, as the trees took shape and the lines of descent intersected, was a retired former police officer in his 70s named Joseph James DeAngelo, living in Citrus Heights, Sacramento County. The confirmation of that identification came through conventional surveillance. Investigators placed DeAngelo under observation and waited. On one occasion, they collected a discarded tissue he had left in a public location. On another, they recovered genetic material from other items he had handled and left behind. The DNA recovered from these discarded items was tested against the crime scene profile that had been collected across 11 California counties over 12 years of offenses. The match was exact. The investigators who had been hunting the Golden State Killer for more than 4 decades now had a name and an address. On April 24, 2018, officers approached DeAngelo as he came out of his house in Citrus Heights and arrested him without resistance. He was 72 years old. In the interview room, apparently unaware that he was being recorded, he spoke to himself. "I did all those things," he said. "I destroyed all those lives." DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 related counts of kidnapping. The more than 50 rapes he had committed could not be charged because the statutes of limitations applicable at the time the crimes were committed had expired decades earlier. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, the practical realities of a capital trial built on evidence that was in some cases 4 decades old, witnesses who had aged, some of whom had died, evidentiary challenges that a prolonged capital proceeding would have magnified, led to a different resolution. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo appeared before the court and pleaded guilty to all 13 murder counts and to 13 rape-related charges, and additionally admitted his responsibility for dozens of uncharged sexual assaults before which the statute of limitations had expired. In exchange, the death penalty was taken off the table. The sentencing that followed in August 2020 was held not in a conventional courtroom, but in a university ballroom in Sacramento, a space large enough to accommodate the extraordinary number of survivors, victims' family members, and members of the affected communities who had waited years, decades, to stand before the man who had done what he had done to their lives. For 3 days, the court heard victim impact statements that described in personal, specific, and devastating detail what Joseph DeAngelo had taken from people who had done nothing to deserve it. Survivor Gay Hardwick looked at him directly and told him, "You were the nightmare that haunted our childhoods. Now you get to live with yours." DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair throughout the proceedings. Prosecutors contended that the wheelchair was not medically necessary and served as a deliberate presentation to the court. At the very end of the hearings, before sentencing was imposed, DeAngelo rose from the wheelchair, removed his mask, and addressed the court for the first and only time. "I listened to all your statements, each one of them," he said, "and I'm truly sorry for everyone I've hurt." Sacramento County Superior Court Judge Michael Bowman then sentenced him to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He is currently held at Corcoran State Prison in California, where he will die. The genetic genealogy technique that CeCe Moore applied to expose him has since been used in hundreds of additional cold cases across the United States. The relatives who uploaded their DNA to public genealogy databases seeking ancestral connection had no idea they would become, in Moore's words, a way to make the dead speak.